90. That is the number of genera of giant mammals that vanished from North America in a span so short it barely registers on the geological clock. Nearly 70% of every large mammal this continent had ever produced, erased within a few thousand years, not gradually thinned out across some comfortable, unhurried stretch of deep time. Erased in geological terms almost overnight. It was not an asteroid. It was not a single catastrophic morning that rewrote the world in an instant. It was something slower, quieter, and stranger. And to this day, no one can say with total certainty what pulled the trigger. No scorched layer in the rock, no single smoking gun. Just an entire cast of continent-dominating giants present in the fossil record for tens of thousands of years. And then, suddenly, gone. Why did the largest mammals North America has ever known disappear at almost exactly the same moment humans first set foot on this land? That is the question that will guide every step of this story. Go back for a moment, tens of thousands of years. Forget the continent, you know, with its highways and cities and fenced-in farmland. Picture instead a grassland, stretching to the horizon in every direction, stiff with frost-hardened grass and a wind that never really stops, where herds of creatures the size of houses move quietly through the morning fog. This was the world of the late Pleistocene, the ice age that history books compress into a single sentence, but which actually lasted roughly 129,000 years, longer than the entire span of recorded human civilization repeated more than 20 times over. The last great glacial period began around 126,000 years ago and did not end until roughly 11,000 years ago. An instant, geologically speaking, but a stretch of time so vast that entire lineages of giants were born, lived, and died without ever knowing that this world would one day come to an end. Researchers who study this era make a comparison that sounds almost unbelievable. They say North America, at its peak, rivaled today's African savanna in the sheer richness of its large mammal life. That is not poetic exaggeration. It was a real, living, dangerous landscape. An icy safari where predators and prey of staggering size fought for space on a scale that simply does not exist anywhere on Earth today. Further north, across what is now Alaska and the Yukon, an even colder world stretched toward the horizon. Thuringia, a windswept, treeless plain, and beyond it, in places, ice sheets more than a mile thick pressing down on the land, fed by glacial lakes that no longer exist. Somewhere within that immense, frozen theater, glacier to the north, open grassland to the south, and an unbroken procession of giants moving between the two, an entire ecological order took shape, one built on a scale so large it is difficult, standing in a modern parking lot or a quiet suburban field, to truly picture it. But who exactly were these giants that vanished without leaving anything close to an heir? Start with the herbivores, because everything else in this ecosystem was built on top of them. The woolly mammoth is the first image that comes to mind. And for good reason. A full-grown adult could stand up to 11 feet tall at the shoulder, weigh between 6 and 8 tons, and carry curved tusks stretching as long as 15 feet, twisted like the horns of some ancient god. To fuel a body of that scale, a single mammoth needed to consume roughly 440 pounds of grass every single day, the weight of a grown man, swallowed whole in forage, repeated at every sunrise. Beside it, in the forests further south, lived the mastodon, a distant cousin, shorter and stockier with straighter tusks, built not for the open steppe, but for denser woodland. Two colossal relatives occupying two very different worlds within the same continent. And then there was something even stranger, the giant ground sloths. It is hard to believe, but true, the sloth that today weighs about 11 pounds and hangs, slow and harmless, from tropical tree branches once had ancestors that, standing upright on their hind legs, reached nearly 12 feet tall and weighed as much as 4 tons. One of them, Megalonyx jeffersoni, became famous for an unusual reason. When its bones were first uncovered, Thomas Jefferson himself examined them and concluded, mistakenly, that they belonged to some undiscovered species of giant lion. He named the creature Megalonyx, giant claw, never imagining he was looking at the remains of a sloth heavy enough to outweigh a modern bear on its own. Picture that animal for a moment, not curled around a tree branch, but standing upright on the open plain, using its massive curved claws to hook and pull down entire tree limbs, its huge ground-shaking frame utterly unlike anything that carries the name sloth today. Here is the first paradox of this story. The animal we now associate with slowness and fragility was once one of the largest land herbivores North America had ever produced. And these giants did not stand alone on the plains. Vast herds of steppe bison grazed alongside them, along with camels and horses that, strange as it sounds today, were themselves native to this continent long before either species was reintroduced by later human hands. An entire community of colossal grazers moving together across the frost-hardened grass, each one requiring an almost unthinkable quantity of food just to stay alive for one more season. Giants of that size, of course, did not survive by chance, unguarded and unchallenged. Wherever that much meat walked across the plains, something, inevitably, learned to hunt it. And what hunted in that world had no equal on any other continent of the time. The short-faced bear, Arctodus simus, was the largest land carnivore ever to walk North America. Standing on its hind legs, its reach exceeded 14 feet. One scientist, trying to capture the creature in a phrase that would make sense to modern ears, simply called it a grizzly on stilts. But the single most iconic predator of that age remains Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat, weighing between 350 and 620 pounds, roughly 5.5 feet from hip to nose, not counting the tail, with serrated canines nearly 7 inches long, jutting from its jaw like twin blades, comparable in size to an African lion, but with shorter, thicker limbs, built not for speed, but for the raw strength needed to pin down a colossal prey animal before it had any chance to fight back. Every bone in that skeleton speaks the same language: ambush, not pursuit. A creature engineered to end a fight in seconds, not to sustain a chase across open ground. None of these hunters acted alone. The dire wolf, Canis dirus, ran in packs of 30 or more. Entire coordinated units organized to bring down mammoths and giant sloths with skulls up to a foot long and teeth larger than anything found in a living gray wolf today. And at the very top of that pyramid stood the American lion, larger than today's African lions, an apex predator on a continent that, at the very same time, sustained giant bears, saber-toothed cats, wolves that hunted in armies, and lions of terrifying size, all competing for the same territory. Even the fastest prey were not safe. The American cheetah, built for explosive speed across open ground, and the scimitar-toothed cat, with its long legs and blade-like canines built for chasing down young mammoths, on the open steppe, filled niches that today have no equivalent anywhere on this continent. No savanna on Earth today supports that concentration of predatory power. It was a world stretched taut, balanced on a knife's edge between hunger and survival, with no room for error, and, it would seem, no room for unprepared intruders. Shadows stretch long across the frozen plain. Something new is crossing the land bridge, and it doesn't yet know the danger it represents, or the danger it is walking into, because it was into exactly this landscape that an entirely new species arrived. Somewhere between 14,000 and 25,000 years ago, groups of humans crossed Beringia, the treeless land bridge connecting Asia to North America, scoured by relentless wind, traveled also by migrating steppe bison and scimitar cats. They crossed on foot, in small family groups, carrying everything they owned, following game trails through a landscape that offered no shelter beyond what they could build with their own hands. These newcomers were not giants. They carried no tusks, no claws, no bulk to rival a short-faced bear or a full-grown mammoth. What they carried instead was something no other predator on that continent possessed: tools, coordinated group planning, and the ability to hunt in packs, creatures that had likely never encountered an upright, two-legged hunter before, and so, perhaps, had no instinct to fear one. These newcomers moved in small, mobile bands, following the herds the way every other predator on the continent had learned to do, except that they carried something entirely new into that ancient balance: fire, coordinated ambush, spears tipped with worked stone, and the ability to pass knowledge from one generation to the next without waiting for evolution to catch up. Notice the coincidence in the timeline, because it lies at the very heart of this mystery. Human arrival lines up almost perfectly with the moment the megafauna began to collapse. This was not a loose, easily dismissed overlap buried in the margins of the data. It was a near-perfect convergence of two stories that, until that moment, had never crossed paths. For hundreds of thousands of years, that ancient world had absorbed every shock nature could throw at it. Ice ages advancing and retreating, sea levels rising and falling, entire landscapes transforming from tundra to forest and back again. And the great herbivores and their giant predators had always found a way through. This time was different. And when the collapse came, it happened too fast to be pure coincidence, yet too slowly to be a single event. Over roughly 5,000 years, a blink of an eye on a geological timescale, but still hundreds of human generations, around 90 genera of mammals, weighing more than 97 pounds, simply vanished from the continent. Mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, short-faced bears, American lions, American cheetahs. Nearly 70% of all the megafauna North America had ever hosted was wiped out within that narrow window, concentrated mostly between roughly 12,000 and 10,000 years ago. Was it climate? Was it hunting? Or was it both, tangled together, each one feeding the other? This is where the science divides, and it is worth being honest about that. There is still no fully settled consensus. One line of researchers points to climate. The end of the last glacial period brought rapid warming, interstadial periods that transformed open, productive grasslands into scrubbier, less nourishing vegetation, incapable of sustaining massive populations of giant herbivores. Another line of thinking points to almost the opposite. The Younger Dryas, an abrupt cooling event that occurred roughly between 12,900 and 11,700 years ago. which may have destabilized ecosystems already under strain. A third major theory, the Pleistocene overkill hypothesis, argues that humans themselves, arriving on a continent full of enormous, naive prey with no learned fear of an upright predator, simply hunted faster than populations could recover. Some researchers also raise the possibility that diseases carried by humans or by their dogs played a role. Pathogens for which giant, previously isolated species would have had no evolved defense, spreading silently through populations long before any hunter ever raised a spear against them. None of these explanations taken alone seems to account for everything, and it is worth clearly setting aside one theory that has circulated widely. The idea that a comet impact roughly 12,900 years ago triggered the cooling and the extinction cascade that followed. That hypothesis is now considered largely discredited by most specialists, among other reasons because it fails to explain why megafauna on different continents disappeared at different times rather than all at once. Perhaps the most honest answer is also the most uncomfortable one. Climate, hunting, and ecological collapse were not competing explanations. They were collaborators. Shifting grasslands weakened the giant herbivores. Weakened herbivores became easier targets for newly arrived human hunters, and the loss of those herbivores, in turn, dragged down the giant predators that depended entirely on them for survival. A cascading collapse where every broken link accelerated the next. It is worth pausing on how strange this really is. This was not a fragile ecosystem clinging to survival by a thread. It was, by every measure available to paleontologists, one of the richest, most productive large mammal ecosystems the planet had ever produced. Layer upon layer of grazers, browsers, and predators, refined and rebalanced over hundreds of thousands of years of glacial cycles. For a system built with that much resilience to unravel within only a few thousand years suggests that whatever combination of forces was at work, it was operating on multiple fronts at once, hitting the giants from every direction simultaneously. Climate above, hunger from the shrinking grasslands, and, for the first time in their evolutionary history, a predator on two legs that did not behave like anything they had ever learned to fear. If there is one place on Earth where this history becomes something you can almost touch, it is Los Angeles. Specifically, the La Brea tar pits. For thousands of years, that patch of the continent functioned as a near-perfect natural trap. A wounded animal would stumble into the asphalt, become stuck, and cry out. And that cry would draw in predators. The predators, in turn, would often become trapped themselves, straining toward meat they could see, but never quite reach. A cruel cycle repeated countless times across millennia that turned those tar pits into one of the richest deposits of carnivorous megafauna fossils anywhere on the planet. From this single site alone, more than 3,000 saber-toothed cat fossils and more than 4,000 individual dire wolves have been recovered. Numbers that, on their own, reveal just how common it was for these giant predators to be locked in fierce competition over the very same doomed carcass. And the fossils of La Brea tell another, subtler story. The bones of Glyptotherium, the giant armored cousin of the modern armadillo, have been found bearing bite marks from saber-toothed cats, direct evidence that even the most heavily armored herbivores, built like living tanks, were not safe. Layer after layer over thousands of years, bones settled into that black, viscous ground, predator on top of prey, prey tangled with the next predator drawn in by its cries. until the pits became something close to a perfect time capsule of that entire vanished world, compressed into a few dark acres of what is now one of the largest cities in the United States. These fossils do not solve the mystery of the extinction. If anything, they deepen it, because if this ecosystem was robust enough to sustain so many giant predators competing fiercely with one another, thriving in such numbers that a single trap could catch thousands of them over the centuries, what could possibly have been powerful enough to make that entire balance collapse? The answer, as far as the evidence suggests, was not one single cataclysmic event, but a cascading unraveling. Without abundant grasslands, the great herbivores dwindled. Without herbivores to hunt, the great predators dwindled soon after. And on the ruins of that world, only the smaller, more adaptable, more generalist species managed to make it through. Bison, caribou, muskoxen, creatures built not for dominance, but for flexibility, able to eat a wider range of plants, able to squeeze through narrower ecological gaps, able to survive on less when the great grasslands stopped producing enough to feed a mammoth or a ground sloth. Scale, it turned out, was not the advantage it had always seemed to be. In a world being pulled apart by climate and by a brand new predator, being smaller, faster to reproduce, and less picky about food became the trait that mattered most. And, of course, humans, who had arrived just in time to witness, and quite possibly to accelerate, the end of an entire era. It is worth remembering one more giant that also failed to survive, the Irish elk, standing up to nearly 7 feet tall at the shoulder, its antlers spreading as wide as 11.5 feet, the largest species of deer ever recorded in the history of the Earth. It too disappeared alongside the mammoths, the mastodons, the saber-toothed cats, and the giant bears, leaving behind nothing but fossilized bone and a question that still troubles scientists around the world. But not everything ended all at once. On a few isolated Arctic islands, small populations of mammoths survived long after the continental collapse, persisting until as recently as 4,500 years ago. Pause on that for a moment, because it deserves to sink in. While the pyramids of Egypt were already rising out of the desert sand, a handful of icy islands still had living woolly mammoths walking across them, the last remnants of a world that had, for the rest of the planet, already gone silent long before. Isolated survivors, forgotten by time, final witnesses of an age that refused to end all at once, cut off from the mainland, safe from the human hunters who had already reshaped the rest of the continent. Those island mammoths shrank over generations into smaller, hardier versions of their ancestors, a quiet, almost invisible postscript to a story that everywhere else had already reached its ending. They grazed in silence on windswept island grass, while thousands of miles away, entire human civilizations were being born, rising and building monuments meant to outlast time itself. Two timelines moving in parallel, neither one aware of the other, until now. And it is here that this story stops being only about the past and starts being about us. Because the landscape we now call normal, quiet grasslands, empty of giant predators, empty of herds of house-sized herbivores, empty of the constant tension between colossal hunters and colossal prey, is not, in fact, the natural state of things. It is a diminished echo. It is what remained after roughly 70% of an entire continent's largest mammals were erased from the map within a few thousand years. Every time you look out over an open, silent plain and see nothing but stillness, You are, without realizing it, looking at the shadow of a world that was once immeasurably wilder, more dangerous, and richer than anything left standing today. No lions crossing the horizon, no bears rising 14 feet into the air on their hind legs, no packs of dire wolves testing the edges of a mammoth herd at dusk. Just grass, wind, and silence. Silence that we have mistaken for thousands of years for the way things have always been. We built our idea of wilderness on top of an already emptied stage, and then, generation after generation, forgot that the stage had ever held anything larger. The wind still moves across that plain today, the same wind that once carried the scent of mammoth herds for miles. It is looking still for something that is no longer there. And perhaps that is the most uncomfortable lesson buried in this entire story. Mass extinction does not always arrive as a sudden flash of lightning, an asteroid falling from the sky on an ordinary morning. Sometimes it is slow, quiet, spread out across generations who never even realize, while they are living through it, that they are witnessing the end of a world without enough time to adapt, without enough room to retreat, without predators capable of restoring the balance. The giants of the Ice Age simply faded away, one after another, leaving behind nothing but bones, tar-soaked fossils, and questions that science, even now, has not been able to fully close. Life, of course, did not end when the giants disappeared. It never does. It adapted, contracted, and rebuilt itself around smaller frames and quieter rhythms, the way it always has after every great upheaval in its long, uneven history. But something was lost in that contraction that has never come back. A scale, a wildness, a sense of a world too vast and too dangerous for any single species to fully claim as its own. We inherited the aftermath. We built our roads, our farms, and our quiet suburban evenings on ground that once trembled under the footsteps of 6-ton mammoths and echoed with the howls of 30 strong wolf packs without ever fully realizing what had once stood there before us. If that combination of a shifting climate and a single new predatory species was enough to completely rewrite the map of wildlife across a continent in only a few thousand years, it is worth asking, what does that say about the speed at which our own world is changing beneath our feet right now, and who this time will still be standing to tell the story? Thank you for crossing this frozen age and this monumental extinction. If this journey through the last giants of North America stirred in you even a fraction of the wonder and unease it stirred in us while researching it, leave a like, share it with someone who also needs to know that the world was once far wilder than we tend to imagine, and subscribe to keep traveling deeper into deep time with us. Every step life has taken to survive until now is, in some small way, also a part of your own story.